This is Broadcasting Rebellion, Pirate Radio, Youth Culture, and Subcultural Resistance, The Who Sells Out by Jenn Farrell in Communications 224.
So we're going to look at the Who Sells Out album. It was released in December of 1967. It was the Who's third album, structured as a fake pirate radio broadcast. The album was a tribute to pirate radio, those ships that used to beam that wonderful music. So what does it mean to sell out? Roger Daltrey described the Who's Sellout album as a tribute to those ships that used to beam their wonderful music. He said, we've been raised on pirate radio for the last 5 years. For the first time ever, we've had DJs, these kinds of renegade people who were just happy to be playing the music they loved. It was very special. That's a striking thing for a rock musician to say about an album. Not we wanted to challenge ourselves artistically, but we wanted to pay tribute to something we'd lost. But what had they lost, and why did it matter enough to build an entire album around it? This presentation argues that the Who Sellouts album is best understood not as an act of commercialism, but as a cultural response to a specific political moment, the forced shutdown of Britain's pirate radio stations in 1967. To make that argument, I'm going to look at what pirate radio actually was, why the government shut it down, and what the album's format tells us about music, youth identity, and the politics of who controls the airways.
It must be remembered radio was the prevailing means of musical distribution, and in the UK, the BBC outright refused to give airtime to, in air quotes, revolutionary rock being peddled by the likes of The Who. With the exception of one commercial TV network, the radio airwaves were owned and controlled exclusively by the British Broadcasting Corporation. And while the BBC did many things well, due to an agreement between the Musicians' Union and Performance Limited, it was restricted to play only 1 hour of pop music each week. The programming was dominated by classical music, news, light entertainment, and children's programs. The BBC's founding mandate was built on the assumption that broadcasting should shape public taste rather than reflect it. Broadcasting should inform, educate, and entertain in that order and with that priority. Entertainment always came last. In other words, the rock and roll revolution that was spreading like wildfire in the United States with bands like The Who, The Beatles, The Kinks, and The Rolling Stones had been all but banished from the British airwaves. Into the gap stepped the pirates. Stations like Radio London and Radio Caroline set up shops on ships. These were retrofitted fishing trawlers, cargo ships, and ferries, anchored off the eastern coast of England, just outside British territorial waters, beyond the reach of UK law. They broadcasted pop and rock music around the clock to millions of listeners on shore. At its peak, Radio London, the station The Who directly referenced on the Sellout album, had an estimated audience of around 9 million people. These were not fringe operations. They developed advanced systems to keep their stations on the air and to avoid detection and confiscation of their equipment by authorities. Some of the biggest bands of the period, including the Stones and The Who, got their first exposure on pirate radio stations. The pirates also played commercials, which was unheard of in the United Kingdom at the time, and the prime motivator behind the endeavor. It was profit. They were enormously popular, and their popularity tells you something important. There was a massive youth audience that the official culture institutions of Britain, aka the BBC, were simply ignoring. The British government's response was the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act, passed in August 1967. The act made it illegal to advertise on or supply pirate stations, effectively strangling their funding and forcing most of them off the air. Radio London signed off on August 14, 1967, and the Who Sellout album was released that December of the same year. The timing matters enormously because it's worth pausing on why the government acted when it did. As cultural policy scholar David Loosley notes, the 1967 Act is a telling example of how British governments consistently treated pop music as purely commercial entertainment, something to be policed rather than supported. Rather than asking why millions of young people had turned to offshore stations, the state simply shut them down. The question of what those listeners actually needed and who was failing to provide it went entirely unaddressed. So how did the band The Who respond? They made the station into an album. The Who Sells Out mimics the format of a Radio London broadcast. Songs are separated by fake jingle advertisements for products like Heinz Baked Beans, Medic Spot Cream, and Charles Atlas muscle building courses. Roger Daltrey appears in the iconic cover photo submerged in a bathtub of baked beans. It's absurd, it's funny, and it's also a precise recreation of the pirate radio listening experience. Townsend has described the concept as something of a rescue operation. The band returned from an exhausting American tour in late 1967 with a contractual obligation to deliver an album by Christmas and with almost no material ready. According to Townsend, it was co-manager Kit Lambert who pulled it together. Kit Lambert made one half of the album into an emulation of a pirate radio station. For me, that is what shaped it. What started as a practical solution became a profound cultural statement, and one that was, as Daltrey put it, released at almost exactly the moment the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act shut those stations down. By structuring the album this way, the band preserved the format of Radio London at the moment it was being silenced. They weren't just making a joke about advertising, they were building a monument to a lost subculture space. The album says this is what it sounded like, this is what it felt like, and the government just took it away from them. It's also important to understand why the loss mattered so much. It helps us think about who is actually listening to the pirate radio and what it meant to them. The Who came out of the mod subculture, a working-class British youth movement defined by sharp fashion, scooters, American R&B, and a very specific attitude towards style as a form of self-expression. Cultural critic Dick Headbridge, in his foundational work on subculture, argues that youth subculture resistance operates precisely through style. Then it begins with a crime against the natural order, and it ends with the construction of a style. In a gesture of defiance or contempt, it signals, in his words, a refusal. Pirate radio was part of that style. It was the soundtrack of mod Britain, and critically, it existed outside of the official cultural apparatus. As Alex DeLacy argues in his study of pirate radio and grime music, pirate stations function as what he calls viable opposition sites, spaces operating outside the mainstream institutions where communities can create, perform, and speak directly to one another without censorship. While DeLacy is writing about early 2000 London, the principles he identified map directly onto 1960s Radio London, when official channels failed to serve a community and that community built its own. As Scott Hayden Church summarizes in his survey of popular music scholarship, Stuart Hall and Paddy Winnell argue that popular music functions as resistance in youth culture, partly because it uses content that mirrors attitudes and sentiments which are already within the youth, and at the same time provides an expressive field and a set of symbols throughout which these attitudes can be projected. Pirate radio was exactly that kind of expressive field. So ultimately, why did the government shut these pirates down? The official justification was about shipping hazards and interference with emergency frequencies, but the cultural stakes were much higher. DeLacy's framework is useful here. He points out that the pirate radio operated as an oppositional space for critique and expression, precisely because official channels, whether state broadcasting in the UK or mainstream commercial radio, were either inaccessible or actively hostile to the communities these stations served. Shutting them down wasn't a regulatory act. It was the removal of a public sphere. Looseley's research on British cultural policy reinforces this point. He argues that the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act reflected a broader pattern in which the British state treated pop as either a commercial commodity or a social problem, never as a legitimate culture form worth of support. The BBC monopoly represented the same logic, a state-sanctioned institution deciding the sonic diet of an entire population, with no accountability to the young people it was supposed to serve. This is where Adorno is worth bringing in briefly. In Unpopular Music, Adorno argues that the structure of popular music production functions to standardize listening habits and condition audiences into patterns of distractive and passive consumption. His concern is with the culture industry controlling what people hear. But here's the twist. Pirate radio, by operating outside the industrial system, actually disrupted the standardization Adorno feared. It was genuinely unpolished and unregulated by government control, and that's exactly what made it threatening. To look at an example, we can look at Radio London. Radio London launched in December 1964, broadcasting from a ship called MV Galaxy, anchored off the coast of Essex. It modeled itself on American Top 40 radio. Fast-talking DJs, jingles, tight playlists, and it quickly became one of the most listened to stations in Britain. Its DJs included figures who would go on to major careers in British broadcasting, including Kenny Everett and John Peel. Radio London didn't just play music, it created a listening community. For millions of young British people, it was the primary way they heard new music, including American soul and R&B that the BBC largely ignored. It was a space that belonged to them in a way that official broadcasting never did. When it signed off on August 14, 1967, the final broadcast included a farewell message and the playing of A Day in the Life by the Beatles. Listeners reportedly flooded the BBC with complaints. It was a genuine cultural moment, a community losing something it had built outside of the institutions that were supposed to serve it. The offshore stations had been a lifeline for pop music fans over the previous years, and as well as providing crucial airtime for bands and artists, including The Who. Now there is still a critical question worth asking. Was The Who sellout an act of genuine resistance, or did releasing it on a major label ultimately undercut the message? This is the real tension. Kornfield points out that in pirate radio's case, the challenge was transformational. It offered something genuinely new that the official system refused to provide. But once the pirates were shut down, the BBC launched Radio 1, essentially incorporating the pirate format into the official broadcasting structure. The resistance was assimilated. Business as usual resumed. The Who Sells Out follows a similar logic. It honors the pirate spirit, but it does so as a commercial product distributed through exactly the kind of industry that the pirates were, in a sense, working around. You could argue, drawing on Adorno's concept of pseudo-individualization, that even the album's apparent rebelliousness is packaged and sold back to young listeners as a product that feels countercultural while remaining fully embedded in commercial structures. But I would argue the album is more interesting than pure co-optation. It holds the contradiction open rather than resolving it. The fake ads are too weird, too self-aware, too obviously absurd to function as straight commercial product. The album as a concept knows what it's doing. And that self-awareness, performing the commercial form while winking at it, is its own kind of critical stance. So what does the Who Sells Out album ultimately tell us about music, media, and power? Music critic John Dugan, writing about the album for the 33 and Third series, describes it as a reflective work, one that struggles with rock and roll as a cultural expression that aspires to aesthetic performance while marketed as ephemeral. From this conflict emerges a pop art masterpiece. The tension between ephemeral pop and something that wants to last, between commercial product and cultural statement, is exactly what makes this album worth studying. It doesn't resolve the contradiction, it inhabits it. It tells us that the question of who controls the airwaves is never just a technical or legal question. It's always also a cultural and political one. When the British government shut down Radio London, it wasn't just regulating radio frequencies. It was deciding whose culture got amplified and whose got silenced. The Who Sells Out responded by doing what popular music does best. It preserved a moment, gave form to a loss, and turned a subcultural experience into something that could be shared, remembered, and questioned. Whether the act was genuinely resistant or ultimately just another product is a question the album refuses to fully answer. Thank you very much.